Most people think they know how much their government owes. They hear the numbers on the news, see them printed on government websites, and assume national debt is a straightforward statistic. But what if the debt figures we see are only the visible layer? What if the real burden, the true cost of government borrowing, is hidden behind accounting tricks, legal loopholes, financial engineering, and layers so complex that even experts struggle to measure them? What if the world we live in is supported not by the debt we can see, but by the debt we can't? Because here, as the uncomfortable truth, almost every government on earth hides part of its debt from the public. Some do it quietly, some do it aggressively, and some depend on it so heavily that revealing the full number would shake the foundations of their economy. The mystery isn't whether governments hide debt, the mystery is how they do it, and why the global financial system quietly allows it. To understand how governments learned this art, we need to go back centuries, before modern budgets, before spreadsheets, before finance ministries existed. In the earliest days of organized states, rulers relied on taxes, land, and war to fund their ambitions. If they needed more wealth, they seized it or took it by force. But as societies grew more complex, rulers began borrowing. In medieval Europe, city-states like Florence and Venice forced wealthy families to lend money to the government, creating early public debts. But these debts were almost never repaid. Instead, they were rolled over again and again, hidden behind new promises. It was an early version of what governments still do today: shift financial obligations into the future and call it something other than debt. A turning point came in 1694, during England's war with France. Desperate for funds, King William III turned to merchants and promised them a steady stream of interest, payments funded by future taxes. To manage this arrangement, the Bank of England was created, and with it, the modern government bond. It was revolutionary. For the first time, the state could spend money it didn't yet have, and lenders received a tradable promise guaranteed by the government. But not all liabilities appeared on the government's official books. The crown relied on colonial companies, monopolies, and early quasi-government entities to carry debts that were technically separate from the state. It was the birth of off-balance sheet borrowing, a technique that would become standard practice centuries later. By the 20th century, public debt had become a normal part of democratic societies. But voters disliked seeing large debt numbers. Politicians knew they had to spend to win elections, yet admitting the true cost was politically dangerous. Instead of cutting spending or raising taxes, they turned to accounting methods that kept debt out of sight. This was the era when unfunded liabilities, such as pensions and healthcare, began to grow rapidly. Governments promised benefits far into the future but did not account for those promises as debt. They were obligations, not liabilities. It was technically correct, but financially misleading. At the same time, new state-owned companies, public agencies, and special-purpose vehicles were created. These entities borrowed money for infrastructure and public services, but because they were legally separate from the state, their debt didn't appear on the national balance sheet. By the late 20th century, globalization provided governments with powerful new tools to hide debt. Money moved across borders more easily. New financial products allowed borrowing without calling it borrowing. Some countries created sovereign wealth funds that borrowed to invest. Others used private banks to arrange synthetic loans that didn't appear in government statistics. One of the most infamous cases occurred in the early 2000s, when Greece used complex financial swaps arranged by global banks to hide part of its debt so it could meet European Union entry requirements. But Greece was not alone. Many European countries used similar tricks, on smaller scales. China relied on thousands of local government financing vehicles, companies controlled by regional officials, to borrow trillions for construction, without reporting it as government debt. The United Kingdom used private finance initiatives to build hospitals and schools off the books. Even the United States relied on entities like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to absorb mortgage risks that were ultimately backed by taxpayers. B2 2008 financial crisis hit. Hidden debt existed everywhere. Economists estimated that several major countries had off-balance sheet liabilities equal to 20 to 40% of their official debt. The practice was no longer a political strategy. It had become a global system, one that both governments and markets depended on. Hidden debt works until it doesn't. When economies slow down, tax revenues fall, and financial stress builds, the hidden obligations suddenly surface. Greece is the clearest example. In 2010, auditors discovered massive, off-book debts. Markets panicked. Borrowing costs soared. The country entered one of the worst economic crises in modern history. But this pattern appears around the world. China's local financing vehicles face repayment pressure after real estate markets weakened. Puerto Rico defaulted in 2016 after public corporations accumulated debts that were not reported transparently. Detroit's 2013 bankruptcy was triggered largely by unfunded pension obligations, promises the city made but never accounted for. When hidden debt surfaces, the impact is severe. Pensions may be cut, taxes rise, public services shrink, governments impose austerity, infrastructure projects freeze, and ordinary people, not politicians, absorb the cost. Governments rarely default outright. Instead, they restructure, refinance, or shift the burden elsewhere. But the impact is always the same. The public pays for decisions they never saw. After every crisis, leaders promise transparency. New agencies are created. New rules are introduced. But the incentives never change. Politicians still want to spend without appearing irresponsible. Voters want services without higher taxes. Markets prefer stability over sudden honesty. And global institutions rely on countries maintaining a facade of financial strength. Hidden debt persists because revealing the full truth would be politically catastrophic. It is easier to move liabilities into the future than confront them today. Today, hidden debt appears in many forms. Off-balance sheet entities, controlled by cities, regions, or state-owned enterprises, borrow money in the background. Unfunded liabilities, especially pensions and healthcare obligations, grow quietly as populations age. Governments make implicit guarantees, promising to rescue banks or companies if they fail, even though these promises do not appear as debt until disaster strikes. Central banks purchase government bonds, effectively shifting debt from public markets to institutional balance sheets. Non-bank lenders, part of the global shadow banking system, provide credit outside traditional reporting structures. According to global studies, hidden public liabilities may total tens of trillions of dollars worldwide. The real number is unknown, because by definition, hidden debt is designed not to be seen. So, what can we learn from all of this? First, official debt numbers are incomplete. They tell only part of the story. Hidden liabilities, whether pensions, guarantees, or off-book borrowing, matter just as much as the debt governments publish. Second, hidden debt is not always malicious. Some of it exists because the modern world requires enormous government involvement in infrastructure, healthcare, finance, and aging populations. But hiding these obligations creates long-term risks. Third, the global financial system depends on confidence. Debt works not because it is perfectly measured, but because people believe governments can manage it. When that belief weakens, hidden liabilities become real crises. The greatest danger is not the debt we can see, but the debt we don't. Hidden obligations act like fault lines beneath the global economy, quiet, ignored, and invisible, until the moment they rupture. And when that moment comes, governments don't just face financial trouble, they face a crisis of trust, the most powerful and unpredictable force in economics. Because understanding the world means looking beneath the numbers, beneath the reports, and beneath the systems designed to stay out of sight.